Hello and welcome to an Envato Tuts Plus tutorial. I'm Adi Purdila, and in today's video you'll learn how to create a design system in Figma. Well, actually a part of a design system. You see, recently I designed this WordPress gardening theme, and this will eventually be coded and you'll be able to download it as well. Now, because the theme will end up in the hands of a developer, I wanted to create a design system for it, and this system will help both of us. It will help me design new pages in the future and make sure everything is consistent, and it will also help the developer by creating an efficient coding process, because the system contains all the colors, all the typography information, all the specs for sizing, spacing, and so on. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to tackle two sections of this design system, and hopefully that will give you an idea of how to implement your own. And those two sections are typography and spacing and sizing. So let's begin with typography. Okay, when it comes to typography, the very first thing I do is start by defining the typefaces. This is a WordPress theme for a gardening website, right? So as with any other web design project, it's really important to match the typefaces that we're using to the actual content of the website. And for this, I chose to go with a classic pairing between a serif and a sans serif typeface. The serif will be used mainly for the headings or large titles, while the sans serif will be used for body text. Now, for the serif, I chose Rooney. This is a typeface that I got from Adobe Fonts because I have a Creative Cloud subscription, and it just makes sense for me to get my fonts from here. So Rooney is, I think, a very organic, very natural feeling and very playful serif typeface. It's not as decorative or ornate as the old style serifs. Instead, it has a slightly more modern vibe to it. So I think for the topic of this WordPress theme, gardening, it will work beautifully. Now, to pair this, I chose Freight Sans Pro. This is a sans serif typeface that I think works really well for pages that have lots and lots of text, like in a blog, for example. It has a slightly higher X height than your typical typeface, and that makes sure its readability is also pretty good. And it matches pretty well with Rooney. Now, obviously, for your project, you would be choosing any typefaces you want, but this is my process. So what I do after that is I go to Figma, and I, of course, create my new document here. And the first page, I call it Design System Typography. And in here, I have 4 frames. One where I'll create a visual representation of the typefaces. Next is for headlines, links, and then the last one is for paragraphs and other miscellaneous items. So for the typefaces, what I like to do is just grab my text tool, type in a text. It doesn't really matter what you type in, and then I set that text to the typeface that I chose, and I can also change the font size and the line height to whatever I see fit here. This doesn't really matter. These metrics don't have to be exact. What matters is that you have a visual representation of that typeface here. And then I just, in a different typeface, one that I'm not using in the actual design, I just type in the typeface name, and I just create, usually I just add an auto layout here, and I set 16 pixels of distance between these two items and just call it a day. Just so that I know, okay, this corresponds to this. And then I duplicate this and I use the other typeface, Freight Sans Pro. And I also changed the name here. And that's it. Now I have a visual representation of the two typefaces that I'm using. Now, moving on, let's cover headlines or headings or titles, whatever you want to call this. Basically, here I'm going to create, again, a visual representation of that heading or headline. And then underneath, we'll have some text with the key metrics for that style, meaning font family, font size, line height, letter spacing, and font weight. Now, one of these items will look like this. So let me zoom in here so you can see what we have. We have the visual representation. So this is a full-size replica of the actual style. So we're using Rooney medium, 72 font size, 96 line height. And then underneath, I just write down these properties: font family, size, line height, letter spacing, and weight. And I'm doing this so that the developer can simply print this frame, this artboard, or open it as a PDF on the side and just have all this information available to him without having to, open Figma, click on each individual text element and get its properties from here. I think it's much, much easier. Now, how exactly did I get to these values? 72, 96. Well, when I'm creating the typography for a project, I always like to use a type scale. And a type scale basically looks something like this. We start from a base font size, and then each font size that follows is a multiple of the base and a set ratio. So in our case, this scale starts from the base of 16 pixels, and the next value is 20 pixels, which is 16 times 1.250. This is the ratio. Now, for our project, I'm going to be using an 18 pixel base size, and the scale will be an augmented fourth, or 1.414. And here you can actually get a demo of what or how those headings will look like. And if you look here, we have 71.96 pixels. I always round these off to the nearest full value. So 71.96, I round it off to 72. 50.89, I round it to 51. 25.45, I round it to 25 and not 26. My rule here is basically if the decimal places or the value after the decimal point is higher than 50, then I round up. If it's lower than 50, I round down. So if this were 25.51, I would round it off to 26. So based on these, I got 72 pixels from here, and I used 72 pixels on the font size. Now, what about this line height? Well, I usually start with this. If you don't specify a line height, Figma just automatically calculates it for you. And if you click on it, it actually tells you in this gray text here that the calculated line height is 90. Now you can change this. And because I like to use the 8-point grid system in web design where margins, paddings, heights, things like that are calculated in multiples of 8, I like to set the line height in multiples of 8. The font size doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be a multiple of 8 as long as the line height is a multiple of 8. This is, of course, totally optional. You can set whatever line height you feel works best. But for me, setting this property to a multiple of 8 just makes it so much easier for me. So in my case, I'm going to choose 96 pixels. So with that, the very first headline is done. What I do now is I select this, I duplicate it, and I set the styles for headline 2. So for headline 2, I'm going to be using the next value on the scale, which is 51. So I'm going to say 51. To get that value to where I want, I delete this line height, hit enter. Now it's automatically calculated to 64. And for headings, I usually like to go a little bit higher, so I'm going to select 72. And 72, again, is a multiple of 8. So our headline 2 is going to be 51 pixel font size, 72 line height, 0 letter spacing, and weight will also be medium. And then what I do is I simply replace these values here. And then I move on to headline 3. And then I just repeat the process. So for headline 3, we're going to be using 36 pixels. But this time we're going to be using a regular. And for line height, we'll be using 48 pixels. And then update these values as well. So 36, 48, regular. And then you would just repeat the process for the rest of the headlines, heading 4, 5, and 6. So let me do that for you right now. All right. So for headline 4, I'm using the next value on the scale with a weight of regular. For headline 5, I'm actually switching things up. Because this is now a lower font size, it's getting close to the font size of the body text. So I'm going to use the body text as a font family, which is Freight Sans Pro. And here I'm setting this to 18 pixels, 24 pixel line height, and semi-bold as a weight. Also, this style will be used for headline 5, but also for the form label, the active pagination item, and the active filtering item. Now, when you're first creating this system, you will probably just have the headline 5 selected or entered here. These values can be added as you're using the system and as you're adding new elements to the pages. Finally, headline 6 will be using the same body text typeface, 14 pixels size, 24 line height, 4% letter spacing, and weight semi-bold. Now I added some letter spacing to this because, one, it's a small font size, it's a bigger weight than usual, and also it's uppercase. And whenever you're using uppercase letter, small font size, it's always a good idea to add a little bit of letter spacing because it's much easier to read that text as opposed to not using letter spacing. So with that, the headlines are now done. And what I'm going to do now is create the links and the styles for paragraphs and other miscellaneous items, just like I created these headings. So let me show you those right now. So I'm just going to walk you through these because the process is very, very similar. For links, we have a regular link. We have a special link that we'll use in places like post metadata, maybe in the footer. And then we have a filtering link because in our theme, we're going to be using a filtering system where we can click on certain links to filter a list of items. So this is what it looks like in its default state. If you remember previously, we defined the active filtering item right here, and it's using the same style as headline 5, but this will not actually be a link. So that's why I didn't put it in this other frame. So those are the links, and then paragraphs and other miscellaneous items. Well, we just have the style for the paragraph, something for a muted text, then a style for caption or helper text, a style for breadcrumbs, because we are using breadcrumbs in the design, and a micro text. That's something really, really small. And with that, the typography part is complete. These styles that you define here are more than enough to get you started. Now, of course, depending on your project, you might find that you have other styles that you could add to this system. So go ahead and do that, either in one of these categories or just create another category here that matches the purpose of those elements. So now let's talk about spacing and sizing. Now for spacing and sizing, I'm just gonna browse through these and show you how I prepare this in Figma and what kind of information I include in here. So I've created a new page called Design System Spacing and Sizing, and I have 2 frames for sizing and spacing. So let's start with this. And let me actually hide the UI here so we can see a little bit better. First, I start with a brief explanation of the 8-point grid system I'm using, or 8-pixel system. I'd say what it is, I give a short example, and then I move on to images. On images, I specify that on large images, I don't use the 8-point system because I prefer using a 16:9 ratio, and usually when you have a set width, the height will change proportionally, so you can't have that height set to a multiple of 8 if you want to have a fixed width. Then I talk about the text. I talk about how the font size is based on the type scale, and I also talk about the line height and how the line height value is based on the 8-point system. Then I talk about the icons. So what should we know about the icons? Well, again, they're following the 8-point system. The height of the icons should be 16, 24, and 32. Then I cover dividers. So what kind of dividers are we using? And I also talk about the width of the dividers. Next are margins and paddings. Now, I am using the 8-point system not only for width and height, but also for margins and paddings, and especially the top and bottom values. And here I actually give an example of an actual element that was designed with this rule, and I specify what that element is, and I also specify some of its characteristics here. So the developer can look at this and say, okay, so this is a button, and based on what I read here, I can now see that this button has a padding of 32 pixels, left and right, which is a multiple of 8, and 16 pixels top and bottom, which is also a multiple of 8. So this is how I must now code this button. So that's for sizing. For spacing, I talk about horizontal spacing. So how much space do I need to put in between these 2 items, for example? I document this. And I say that horizontally, items close to one another are spaced apart using these values. And what value you use of course, depends on what elements you use. So, for example, in this tag cloud, the items are separated or are spaced 16 pixels apart. But in this menu, the menu items are spaced 64 pixels apart. Then I talk about vertical spacing, right? So vertically, how much space should I leave between elements? And again, I document this using a few examples. Here I have a footer, and further down below I have a form. And of course, all of these elements are documented separately. Here I'm talking about spacing and sizing in general. So these are examples of how I create the spacing and sizing section from a design system. Yours might vary, but feel free to copy this and use it as a template for your own projects. And when doing documentation like this, you don't really need to do it in Figma. You can create a PDF with it and have it as an annex to the design system. It's really up to you how you decide to do that. And that's how you can start working on a design system in Figma. You take things step by step and you create one element at a time. Now, this video is part of a series of 3 tutorials. And in the other 2, I will show you how to create some of the other parts of the design system. So make sure to stay tuned for that. For now, thank you for watching, and I'm Adi Pordillo. I'll see you next time.